Welcome, everybody, to Poetry Off the Page, where to put poetry besides a flat sheet of paper. I know you all, you know me, but for the record, I am your host today, Sarah E. Morin. I am honored to be your premier poet for one more year. It's been a fast ride. I'm calling myself a host today because we are going to go on a whirlwind tour of things that I found on the internet that are poetry examples that are not on a flat piece of paper. And so how I got inspired to pick this topic is back in winter of 2020, right before the world ended. I was part of a group where we studied the book of Jonah intensely for several months, and different artists of different types. It could be visual art, writers, musicians, from various faith backgrounds. We all studied this and created art based of this. And I thought, well, I'm a writer. I'm just going to type something up and I'm going to maybe print it out on a piece of paper and maybe read it out loud for a final presentation. But we had an artist come in, and she was a Muslim artist and inspired by Muslim art. And she had a big box, and I'll show it to you later. And it inspired me to change my poetry and turn it into something 3D. And as part of this exploration, I started asking myself some questions. It kind of forced me to redefine what I thought of as poetry. And so I would like to ask you as we go through today, does anything that you're seeing change your definition of poetry? Does anything really stand out as particularly inspiring to you from these examples? And what new places could you put your poetry? And feel free to drop these in the chat as we go along, or I will try to save some time at the end. And we will go fast because I have so many fun examples. It was hard editing them down. So I want to also be very clear. I am not saying there's anything bad with writing on a piece of paper or with a flat screen for your computer. I love the social media things that are going on that are also flat things, but what other places are there to put our poetry? So, fasten your seatbelts, we're gonna fly. So I loosely put these into categories. So the first is we're going to start really simple and get weirder as we go along. So paper, but 3D. So all this person did, it is a flat piece of paper, but they just slightly raised each line. And this next one, she spiralized the lines. And she, Lisa Bolin, called this poetic sculpture. And she also played a little bit with shadow intentionally. And you'll see this is also the same person. You really see her playing with shadow in this one. So the words are just popped up circles and she's playing with the shadow as part of the piece. And this was just taken from a teacher site. So again, it's a flat piece of paper, but it's been folded up. So it's now turning it into 3 dimensions. And I'll be showing you today things that are high art, and I don't like the term low art, but things that are, very accessible that anybody could do, things that are commercial, things that are in an art gallery, examples from everywhere. And I loved this example because this is so simple. This is a 3D concrete poem of a snowmobile. And so somebody just made it out of pipe cleaner and it looks like a little bit of tape, but it turned it into something that popped off the page for them.
Sarah E.
All right, I see
there's a comment
here coming in. Yes, I was able to barely see it.
Great,
here.
okay.
Caroline says, I love the sculpture of 2 people which was moving and which merged into one. Yes, that was great. I pulled up that video too, Caroline, and just watched it repeatedly. So for me, that is inspiration, and I can see poetry from that or presented from that. Yeah, that's great. That's great. I loved this example too, where it's kind of a nest of words folding in and out of each other, the dream weaver. And I also love these vertebrae and asylum here. And I'll read a little quote. Through the use of books as objects, as containers, as metaphors, a dialogue with the written text is established in order to break the rigid linearity of its format, and therefore to widen the concept of what is thought of as a book and what it contains. It comprises an intense debate around visual and material dimensions of language. If language forms thought, freeing the limits of language in every single direction will increase the scope of thought. It almost looks like circuitry, doesn't it? And I also got a big kick out of this one. You see that it is a book of poetry, but the artist here has created extra little shapes to illustrate what's going on. All right, next category is wearable poetry. And so these were so easy to find. All you have to do is Google wearable poetry and hit shopping, and you can find everything. There's so much that we can print on demand and customize. And so anything from tote bags, that's the entirety of the Raven, Edgar Allan Poe's Raven on that hat. And I put this other bag up here because I love this quote: "Poetry, the ketchup on the French fries of life." The t-shirt there, buttons, and this umbrella here is written in French. And so I will be including some examples that are not English and are international. So yes, honey, it does remind me of the flowers we had at our wedding. And I see the comment, I can see Shillen really loving the vertebrae one. Yes, with the anatomy and physiology expressions. Yes, beautiful. Yeah, very good. And here are more examples of wearable art. You can see someone took magnetic poetry and just repurposed them into earrings. And I would like to point out with the fingernails and with the tattoo, these are ones that, sometimes we wear our poetry because we want to broadcast that message to the world and share it. But those fingernails, it is so tiny that you aren't really going to be able to read it. And the tattoo, yeah, sometimes you're going to wear something that could reveal that, but a lot of times it's going to be covered up. And so that is not a broadcasting wearable poetry. That's one that you're wearing because it means something to you. Kind of like the tattoo that Alice has, it's something that means something personal to you. People may or may not see that. And so poetry that we wear can be very intimate and meaningful to ourselves. I agree, George. It better be a darn good poem to be a tattoo. Yes. And this beautiful copper bracelet here is E.E. Cummings and his poem, "A Wind Has Blown the Rain Away." I would wear that. And of course, in this time of COVID, you can put your poems on your face mask. I will not read this one aloud, but if you choose to read it to yourself, you may. Leaving it up here so you can enjoy this poem. Oh, did something else start screen sharing? Let me stop this. Sorry there, I think we got on some other web page. Hang on just a second. I will be with you momentarily with the correct information.
While you're doing that, I'll just vamp for a minute and say that the what you referenced, my tattoo, is probably the one where I have for my mom. It's Carry Love, and it's something that we have in our family, thinking about her after she passed away and everything. That idea of carrying her love with us, because she told my kids before she passed away that she would always be with them and that they would carry her love with them. And so it's on my arm, and on my other arm is "Nevertheless she persisted." So, if I'm bare armed, you're gonna get it. You're gonna get my poetry, if you will, my tattoos.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for explaining that, what I was referencing. Yeah. Yes. And I was thinking of the "Nevertheless she persisted" as well.
Yeah, that one. Who would have ever thought I would have something said by that horrible man tattooed permanently on my body? But the idea of it spoke to me, much more than just in that moment what was going on, because to me that represents my mother's family background, coming from Macedonia before World War II, right after World War II broke out. She as a baby was on the last ship out of Europe, the last passenger ship out of Europe for the duration of the war. And just the persistence of my Baba, my grandmother, who didn't speak a word of any other language except Macedonian, making that trip with 2 children under the age of 3 and traveling across the United States to Oregon, where my grandfather was. I mean, that kind of persistence, made me think of that quote as more than just being a quote by a horrible person. So, yeah, so it's more meaningful and poetic than you might think. That's end of my vamp.
Thank you, Alice. And a few comments came in. I am enjoying, Anne, your humor here. If you're reading this, you're too close. and yeah, it is from a performativity aspect. The fingernails are presenting the idea of poetry as opposed to the poem itself. Yes, and I agree. Rodka was a wonderful woman. So this next one is by Leslie Dill. And so I'll read a little review that I found about it. The mission of Leslie Dill's Faith in the Devil could not be any more ambitious. The artist aims to examine the eternal struggle between faith and evil in philosophy and literature. To us, this sounds like the college thesis from hell. And standing amidst the installation, you start to get the feeling that the artist began to go mad in the process.
Honey, we can't see that.
Oh, you can't see that?
No.
I am so sorry. Let me try this again.
Share screen.
Okay, let's try this one. Now can you see it?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so now you can see the college thesis from hell. For her exhibition, Dill covers George Adams' gallery in textual snippets that come together like a Victorian ransom note. Words cover everything. They spin, contort, and explode across the gallery walls and floor. In the center of the exhibition stands Big Gal Faith, an 8-foot-tall woman whose wild word hair and gentry couture express the main themes of the exhibit, according to Dill's artist statement. So I put this in the category of wearable art, although clearly no one's going to wear this except for the art exhibit itself. But it's still in that category because it is recognizable as a dress.
Is that a dress form underneath it?
Yes. Yeah, that's Big Gal Faith there. An 8-foot-tall dress form.
Gotcha.
Okay.
It's in peace.
And this is also by the same artist. It's called Unwearable Art. This actually does open up. So it does look like you could, if you were that ambitious, step into it and have it be closed behind you. But it's another example of a poem that is written into a dress. She may be headless. I didn't see a head. That's a good comment coming from Caroline there. And this wedding dress here, you're noticing a lot of poems here written into wedding dresses or dresses of other types. And my guess is it's this huge, broad canvas. Kate Dottie's wedding dress features a poem cascading down the back from the waist, bright against the white fabric. The final few lines spill out to the edge of the hem, reading "A bunch of bleeding roses." And this is not a new idea. This particular series of sketches here comes from 1922. And so this was somebody who incorporated French poetry into the garments and was quite popular. And this even appeared on the runway just a couple years ago in fall and winter of 2019. And so the most talked about moment was at the hands of, and I cannot say this artist's name, I'm not going to try, but you see it written there, that's why I typed it. This artist collaborated with 4 contemporary poets, and they embedded their captivating words in the folds of the most ethereal Valentino gowns. And they also then took these quotes and they put them into little poetry chapbooks, and everybody who was there at the runway had one on their chair, which is, lovely double dipping. And I personally, I would wear this one with the rose. I think that's just lovely. And it was not just for the ladies. The guys also, you can barely see there's some text there along the sides. Next category is garden poetry. I included this one. This particular one is from Etsy. And I do not know the artist's actual name, but they sell under Corto 17. And how they present their poems is just to print them on little cards and put them into packets. Now, that's still a flat piece of paper. I'm not cheating because it inspired an idea, which is, why couldn't you do packet seeds, seed packets, and put your poems that way? And that would just raise that to another type of 3-dimensionality. You could have little signs in your garden. This one was for sale on Amazon. Sarah Solway here. This came from the Middle-Sized Garden blog. All the gardens I visited were open to the public, some as a business, others on certain days of the year. And here's where I must confess that I am not a trained gardener or plants woman. I learned a new word, plants woman. I did learn the names of flowers and trees as I went along, but because my interest was always as a writer, I tried to tour the gardens instead through my senses, listening to my emotional responses. It was a different way to engage with the space, and for every garden I visited, I wrote a poem. And so what she did with her poems is she has tied them on these little pieces of, it's either ribbon or maybe paper. It's hard to tell from this picture, but they're tied to this garden obelisk. And so they can blow in the wind. This is just a plaque that's on a garden wall. And this is at Canterbury Cathedral. Yeah, it is kind of like a mini bookmarker, Caroline. Yeah, you're right. And that's another place you can put your poetry. And here's someone who did it in a much more low-tech way and just decided, okay, I can handwrite this on there. Ah, yes. What a wonderful segue. That's coming soon, honey.
Oh.
And I also found poetry gardens. Usually they're very small, but they're throughout several communities in the US. This particular poetry garden was created in 2006. It's located in the heart of the Seattle Center campus. The small garden is composed of crushed granite paths punctuated by 12 sculpted, polished pink granite boulders, engraved with an eclectic section of poems by various authors. And as I studied these, different people will have a poetry garden in different ways. It might have, places for you to contemplate and write, or it might have literal lines written down so you can enjoy someone else's poetry. And some of them have a collaborative element where you can leave poetry as well. I think there is probably a grant proposal in that. This one I enjoyed. This is for sale. You can buy this and put this in your yard. And the sculpture description says a magnificent ancient maldrone tree is surrounded by a simple meditative path sculpture. It is a site-specific installation by commission. This particular one is at Fort Worden State Park in Port Townsend, Washington, but the artist recommends it could be a public art or a home garden or a yard sculpture. So you can commission this artist. And the artist comments, the heavy ropes, which mark the edges of the ritual path, are handmade of jute stuffed with straw. Poetry is hand-stitched along the path in black wool yarn. So the idea is after you put this into its configuration, then you can slowly walk and read and contemplate as you walk. And the poem says, Salal grows in the darker places like love, and like love takes hold in the shadows.
Oh, that's nice. Sarah E., there was a comment from Deborah in there.
Great. Deborah says, during one of the national conventions, we headed out to a nearby garden and added our poems, written on 3x5 cards with ribbons, a poet tree. Oh, the pun makes it even better. Very good. And then again, some of the things we're going to see are going to be expensive. This one is dirt cheap. And I love this idea. They've simply gone out, picked up a leaf, and you can even see how the veins there are inspiring the form itself. And it being fall, when it stops raining and things dry out, I want to get a bunch of different colors of the reds and the yellows. And I'm either going to write poetry on them and put them on the kitchen table, or I'm going to throw them to the wind, and then, Mother Nature will take them to whoever should be reading my poem. And poetry birds, this could be a great idea for your home. I could see it as a public art project where, people just come by for a few hours, they get a little bird cut out, they write their poem, and you hang it on a tree where everybody passing by can enjoy it.
That makes me also think that would be cool to do poetry ghosts.
Ooh, yes, that would be fascinating. I'm enjoying John's comment about the previous slide that it reminds him of diagramming sentences. It does. And poetry rocks. I think several of us have seen these. One interpretation here on the left is just to paste the lines so you have the full poem right on the rock. The other interpretation, and we do this at my workplace, is you put one word per rock and it becomes like magnet poetry, and you can just rearrange it. And then a lot of gardens utilize stepping stones, often for a memorial. My brother and sister-in-law, when they got married, did a stepping stone commissioned of, their heads and, when they got married. And so why not put your poetry on there? And then you can contemplate that as you step along your garden path. Oh, thank you, Chuck, for clarifying who did that poem there on the leaf that was mentioned earlier. Good eye. Oh, very good. Thank you. Everyone, check out Spike's example of the poetry.
I don't think that's the same one that was at the
National Convention?
yeah, I don't think so.
Different poetry. Okay.
I think it's actually school.
Okay.
This one.
Very good. He's just off screen if you haven't guessed. So that brings us on to a transition of memorial poetry. So I challenge you, go to any cemetery and you are bound to find poetry. The one on the left is one that I have seen quoted and I enjoy myself. Do not stand at my grave and weep. I am not there. I do not sleep. And that's one that you will see throughout the country. I also was very touched by this one for Derek Plant. Every phrase and every sentence is an end and a beginning. Every poem an epitaph. So I don't know, Mr. Plant, but that is a beautiful way to be remembered. And I couldn't resist having funny headstones. Here lies Clyde. His life was full until he tried to milk a bull. And then Uncle Walter here, not my uncle, but somebody's uncle. Uncle Walter loved to spend. He had no money in the end, but with many a whiskey and many a wife, he really did enjoy his life. I'm curious to know if you all were going to put a poem on your gravestone, what it would be. So if you want to compose one to yourself, feel free to share that here or at Round Robin. People can quote lyrics. And then this last one here on the right, it's a little funny and a little creepy. Reader, beware as you pass by, as you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you will be. Therefore, prepare to follow me. And this one you'll see scattered throughout the country as well. Thank you for pointing out, honey, that that's something that's ancient as well. And I had to include this one as well. Their website was not very clear, but they appear to be some award-winning memorial and monument artists from London. But you can only read it directly from the front. The poem's called The Last Laugh. And so it kind of breaks up as you turn to the side.
Oh, cool.
Poetry around the house. Financial poetry. Yes, this is a flat piece of paper, but because it was on such an odd surface, I wanted to include this one that you can have poetry on your checks. And I imagine that we have all sat on the throne and enjoyed some bathroom poetry. This one admonishing us to please wash your hands and brush your teeth, flush the potty, put down the seat, wipe your booty and clean your face, leave the bathroom a tidy little place. I guess the idea is that we can enjoy the poetry as we're sitting on the throne and be gently reminded of proper etiquette. A little bit more classy here, we have poetry on a shower curtain. And we also have poetry right here on toilet paper. So the toilet paper is at the left. And this is a Malawian poet. In 1987, he was imprisoned for 4 years for critical views of the government, expressed in his first published collection of poems. So what we see here is actually a letter on the toilet paper that he wrote. But being a poet, I imagine he was also putting his poetry on this toilet paper. So the idea of this very disposable medium, he was using what was available. The one at the right, Lewis Carrion, this is also prison poetry. This is written while he was in transit from one location to the other, and it's on a paper towel. He sent it to his father. His father took a picture of it. And the quote from Lewis here, I mailed it home at some point while incarcerated, and yesterday my father sent me this picture. I keep my past close as a constant reminder who I never want to be again. My story bleeds into my body of work. And apparently this artist is now very popular in California. He's out of prison and he does kind of graffiti inspired artwork, including painting an airplane. Edible poetry, my favorite. So you could have magnetic poetry, just put it on cookies, win-win. And wedding cakes. And Spike and I had a booked theme wedding, so my Pinterest page was full of these, but I love the beauty that you see in these. Yes, I love the idea, George, of fortune cookies with palms. That's a great idea. And I'm sure many of us have been to a wedding where you can customize the message on your chocolates, and it's great. It's a flat piece of paper that you can print, and then you can wrap it around. This one was actually an ad for a poetry event, but it reminded me how many of you as kids would have alphabet soup or maybe alphabet cereal and just play with it. And you're kind of creating poetry there with your food, but you just don't think about it when you're a kid. So inspiration right there. And it being Halloween time, we all need to have some pumpkins with some poetry on them as well. And now that we have our edible poetry, we need to put it on a poetry plate. This one was available for purchase. And you can have your poetry napkins. The beautiful butterfly has poetry in the upper corner. But I also included these examples from social media. And you can see that the napkin here is not meant to be a very beautiful napkin. It's meant to look, because it has little rings from the coffee, like somebody sat down in a restaurant and was inspired in the moment and jotted down their palm, except for it's typewritten. So again, we see that range. It could be something very highly, formal, or it could be something in the moment. Poetry games. This one came from a teacher website. It's popsicle poetry. And so the different colors are like parts of speech. There's whole instructions for how you can mix and match these. And I had to include magnetic poetry. I've been referencing it, but who here has not played with magnetic poetry sometime in the last 3 decades? There are subsets of magnetic poetry. I want to give a shout out to David Allen. David, I looked through your Facebook page for like 25 minutes trying to find a great example, and I didn't go far enough back in your history to grab one. Otherwise, I would have featured you here. But I was thinking of you as I pulled up the magnetic poetry. But yeah, there's subsets now of magnetic poetry. You can get it for different topics. There's erotic magnetic poetry, all types of different ways to take this now. It makes it very accessible for people. Oh, I'm enjoying from Chuck. Chuck once left a poem handwritten spontaneously on a napkin as a tip at a bar. I love that. Yeah, so I like the idea of we leave something behind. It may not be something that, is of a permanence. It's not on a permanent material, but, someone can read it, enjoy it, and maybe it'll be, thrown away, but that's still, reached that other person. So that's great. David says, that's my next book. Buy David Allen's book. Pre-order. I don't know if you're ready for pre-orders, but I'm recommending you. And then I included this because this was an idea that I had. Maybe you could take a normal deck of cards and then face side up, put a word at each edge, and then you play a normal game of rummy. And then at the end of the game, then you can just shift your cards around and make a poem out of that. George asks, do you think that the waiter would accept my poem instead of a tip? Depends on how good your poem is.
Right.
This is a game here that my brother bought for me. And it's one of the guessing game type things like catchphrase or taboo. You can only speak in 1 syllable clues. Oh. So you sound like a caveman. And the best part of this game is that club there, which is inflatable, and you get to bop people on the head when they make a mistake. But the idea, again, is the idea of a poetry game. All right, illuminated poetry. Putting the poem on a candle. Edgar Allan Poe keeps coming up. He's highly sellable. I loved the idea of putting him on a candle because that immediately sets you in nighttime and sets you right in the mood. And I have no idea who Paper Pixie is. This is somebody on Etsy though. And, you know, I still think of these as artworks, even though Paper Pixie did not write the poem. But, you know, who's to say that, you know, something in the art gallery is any more art than is this thing I can find on Etsy? And luminary bags, you can put your poems on these. Anyone want to try this at Christmas time? Or you can propose with them. You can buy these. So maybe buy yourself a set of the whole alphabet, and then, you know, you can write a Christmas poem along your street. And I looked everywhere for a poem in light bright. I could not find one, but that's my next challenge for you. Could we collaborate on a geometric poem mandala? Ooh, you're in charge of organizing that. That sounds fun. Commuter poetry. By commuter poetry, this was basically my lump word for anything you might see as you were just traversing about town. So a lot of these examples are going to be local. They had a sidewalk poetry in Zionsville, very close to me. I entered it, I did not win, but the winners are posted right here. And I'm sure that some of you have sidewalk poetry in your towns or have entered the contest. And who has been to the Indianapolis airport and seen the beautiful windows? The beautiful windows here. I remember when they had the contest, I know at least one of the windows, but when you think about it, with commuter poetry, how many people are going to be waiting on their plane and they're there early? And what else is there to do but look at this beautiful eye-catching window, read this poem, and what exposure. So you might have, you know, tens of thousands, if not millions of people that read your poem. Here are some more of the beautiful airport poetry windows at Indianapolis. And Caroline, what a beautiful, beautiful segue that's coming up. Bus poetry. So here along the Indianapolis Cultural Trail, these are bus stops that have poetry on them. And poetry on buses. This particular example is taken from King County, Washington. They all did the theme about 5 years ago on Your Body of Water and selected 365 poems, one poem per day. And so you can see it right, somebody reading the text. And again, you think about, okay, someone is just standing there. Yeah, their eye's going to fall to your poem. What exposure. I would love to, do you have anything you want to add and unmute yourself, Caroline, about the buses in Fort Wayne and that poetry project?
Well, it was a very fun event that many of our older poets who had been there in the early 90s had really talked about. Unfortunately, I didn't participate in that, but they coordinated with our public transportation corps, which was PTC at that time, CityLink now, and they were very open to having some type of art in there. And we just said, hey, we can give you poetry. And I don't know if we designed the background for it too, to make it pretty, whatever designs. And they accepted it, and they rotated the poetry in and out. And I don't know how many poems we gave them, but it was a very fun, different, successful event because of presenting poetry, like you're saying, in many different ways other than on a flat paper. It was a good thing there. Everybody.
It's fantastic to have the live examples, not just ones that I found far away on the internet. That's fantastic. Deborah, is that a pun? Is that real? Because that seems like that's an in joke. I enjoy that. I'm going to do a series of walls now. This here is at the Wick Poetry Center at Kent State University. It's home to the award-winning Traveling Stanzas Project, and it's one of the premier university poetry centers in the country. And so they have sharing walls and stanza walls. The stanza wall here is a large-scale Scrabble-like poetry wall where adults and children alike can create an individual or group poem out of wood-cut words. And this idea of the community walls, We see this here with Catherine Zahn, who was a artist in residence poet at the Muck in 2020. And so there's blackout poems that the community made here on the right, and they're beautifully framed, and there's artwork surrounding it. But there's also a place where someone can just come along and write something. And we had here in Fishers, not even half a mile from my apartment, we had a board like that. My friend had one in her community, so I'd be curious to know, and you can just drop it in the chat if you've had one of these in your hometown.
There was one on the Butler campus.
Oh, I forgot about that. There was one on the Butler campus. Here is another poetry wall in Venice, California. And so there are excerpts or just short poems, as well as tiles there that are very colorful. And then you can paint your poem on a wall. I'll just breeze through these. Here's one. There's a whole series in, I don't know if you say it Leiden or Leiden, but in the Netherlands. And they had a project of over 110 poems in many different languages painted on their exterior walls. It began in 1992. It finished in 2005. Finished being a loose term because it sounds like there have been more. And apparently this has inspired other communities. The one that's on the top left actually comes from Paris. And then there's the wall. These are excerpts from the Berlin Wall. These are actually pieces of the Berlin Wall. I looked and looked to try to find poetry that was written on the Berlin Wall before it fell. I'm sure it existed. I just did not find pictures, but we know that people were writing all over that wall. But people wrote even more over the wall after it was dismantled, reflecting on that experience. And so the one that you see at left is now placed in Portland, Maine. And the one that's at the right, this is still in Berlin. There is a segment of, it's over 1,000 feet that still stands, and different artists have painted on it, reflecting on that experience. It's in a section called the East Side Gallery, in a section called the Hymn of Joy. And I just want to read it because I found it touching. I painted over the wall of shame, so freedom is ashamed no more. Inferno ruled too many years until the people chose the light. I put my faith in you, Berlin, and give to you my colors bright. Oh, thank you, George. Aretha Franklin had a funeral with an outdoor poetry wall. That's beautiful. And then if you don't want to paint on your wall, you can project poetry on your wall. This event here being depicted, they had a poem-mobile that projected poetry as there were young people that were giving speeches. The topic was about ways in which their life work affects social change. And then this wall here is at Angel Island. And Angel Island is like Ellis Island, but it's on the other coast, Pacific, and it was more about keeping people out, particularly with the Chinese Exclusion Act, really monitoring who was allowed in the country. If you were Chinese and trying to immigrate, you would have to answer a rigorous quiz trying to prove that you were related to somebody. And so what would happen is, I'll just read you an excerpt from the article that I read researching this. What would-be immigrants couldn't tell their interrogators, they inscribed on the walls in the form of classical Chinese poetry, complete with parallel couplets, alternating rhymes, and tonal variations. So Angel Island opened in 1910. In 1970, when the buildings of Angel Island were due to be torn down, a park ranger noticed the inscriptions. That discovery sparked the interest of researchers who eventually tracked down 2 former detainees who had copied poems from the walls while they were housed on Angel Island in the 30s. Their notebooks, additional archival materials, and a 2003 study of the walls, which were preserved, turned up more than 200 poems, and there could be hundreds more buried underneath the putty. The formal qualities of the poetry, which was written for the most part by men and women who had no more than an elementary education, tend to get lost in English translation, but its emotional force comes through. One poem reads, "With 100 kinds of oppressive laws, they mistreat us Chinese. It is still not enough after being interrogated and investigated several times. We also have to have our chests examined while naked. So this really spoke to me. It's very powerful. And you think of, walls as, they're so symbolic. It can be a canvas for creating art. It can be a way of excluding people and a barrier. And so, yeah, it's a great place to put a sentiment, to put something you're feeling very deeply, to place that there on that surface. Yes, thank you for the new Colossus. And bathroom stall poetry. Yes, we'll be getting to that. Absolutely. So graffiti. Graffiti's everywhere. I wanted to start with just a quote. Graffiti is a poem that the city writes to itself. Here are just some brief examples. I won't read this out loud, but here is an entire poem written here on a wall. I enjoyed this one. Without the cracks in the sidewalks and walls, the city cannot breathe. And it's not just here in this country. This is a worldwide phenomenon. This particular person from Panama City has a following, and you can recognize his work by the handwriting here. What this translates into is, when your tongue met my tongue, I trembled a little in paradise. And it's not a new phenomenon. This one from Spain. It's an anonymous text, a love poem found in Spain in the 3rd century. It concludes with the lines, "Go on, love me. It does you good." It was popular across the Eastern Roman Empire in the 2nd century and has been found inscribed on 20 gemstones and as a graffito in Spain. And it's even older. We found graffiti poems in Pompeii. This particular one was discovered in 1888. It's one of the longest and most elaborate surviving graffiti texts from the town. It may be the only known love poem from one woman to another from the Latin world. We're not entirely sure about that, though. A little quote from it. "Oh, if only I could hold your little arms wrapped around my neck and press kisses to your tender little lips. Go then, little doll, trust your happiness to the winds." This is also from Pompeii. This is a quote from Virgil, who was a Latin poet. And I got your back, George. Here's our bathroom poetry. And this is a recognized art form, to the point that I found a website, dedicated it, and somebody has taken the time to analyze it and make this chart so that you too can make high art bathroom poetry. And so there were so many examples, and in order not to make this too blue, I did not include the ones that were effusive about farts and poop, not by those names. But I did want to at least include a small sample. First, a little bit of philosophy. Since writing on bathroom walls is done neither for critical acclaim nor financial gain, it is the purest form of art. So let that sink in as you choose your next art form. And then I love this philosopher here. Our butt cheeks have touched the same surface. We are brothers. We are one. And then there's 2 more examples here. I'm just going to read the one at the right here. They repaint the walls to silence my pen, but the toilet poet strikes again. So yes, if you want to pardon the pun, dive down the deep hole here into bathroom poetry. Yep, people seem to be inspired as they sit on the throne. So this is a recognized genre. And this particular one is on a column at the University of Texas. And if you look carefully, there's 2 poems. And you think of, going to any type of fine arts school. And so, here is the message on the left: art's pointless, go out and get a real job, make a living. And then here on the other side, well, this is why you might want to pursue art. Follow your heart, love your art, inspire people, change the world. So on to some of the more formal poetry you might find in an art gallery. And these were fascinating. So I'll show you a series here from this artist, Miriam Londano. And this is a Colombian artist. And I'll read a little quote here. Her work spins around the use of paper as an available medium to express transformations. Her fine pieces convert paper into the ink with which she paints and writes, building poetry and stories into the air. Her body of work imagines visual poetry, using her work as a reflection on the knowledge. And so you would be hard pressed to walk up to this and actually read a recognizable phrase. You would have to really turn your head. But I think what's important here is that it inspired the artist. The text means something to the artist, just like we were talking about the tattoos and the fingernails. Maybe it's something that only you see, but it's influencing what your outward projection is to the world. So here's an example. Here's another example. And this. And I love these. They work really well from a distance and close up. Linda Lewis here, It Is the Light. A poem written by Marianne Williamson and quoted by Nelson Mandela in one of his well-known speeches continues to inspire me. This is the artist talking. The idea is that we are powerful beyond measure and we need to let our light shine, and that it is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. The surface of this figure has many personal symbols incorporated, and the script is the poem etched into the surface. And I also enjoyed this one right here called My Breath. And as you see, the stripes, they start out as lines, and then they become words in the last panel. So it's repeated poetry in the last panel there. George says a lot of these physical visual ways to place poems are more about the medium than the poem's message. Yeah, I think that you're right to some extent, but I also think that if they chose that poem, it is influencing what they're doing. But yes, you're right that it's hard to access the poem in the same way.
Can I say that I think in person, I would almost disagree with you, George. I think that in person, I bet the poem's message is much more impactful, you know, than just looking at it on a screen like this, maybe. But that's just my thought.
Okay. And I just enjoyed kind of the humor in this one. A horse called poetry, and you can see the lines shaped around the shape of the horse here. Here is a poetry sculpture, and this is from Figment Festival in Boston. It sounds like there's several Figment festivals, and this is just a particular one. A quote from their website: Figment is an explosion of creative energy. It's a free annual celebration of participatory and art culture where everything is possible. For 1 weekend each summer, we transform the Rose Kennedy Greenway into a large-scale collaborative artwork, and then it's gone. So it looks like to me like these pieces aren't fixed, like you can take them apart and reshape them. I don't know for a fact it's intended to be worked that way, but wouldn't it be marvelous if you could come up and just reorder and rewrite a poem that way? This one you can't break apart because it's bronze.
Wow.
This is called The Formation of Poetry, and it is designed as a tribute to the legacy of Dr. Samuel Johnson, who wrote the first English dictionary. I love this one, this Yeats statue. This is in Ireland, and here's a quote from the website. It's notable that rather than an excessively reverent and realistic statue, as is the usual safe choice to honor dignitaries, this statue is flamboyant and a little cheeky. The poet's body is made larger and distorted by a jacket that almost resembles a pair of wings. His clothing is completely covered in words, all excerpts from his poetry, symbolizing the work that was both his legacy and his armor. And I encourage you to look this one up, because if you can get the silhouetted image from a distance, the legs are almost a caricature. They're very thin and very long. And so he's kind of a cartoon in a way. So it's a fascinating piece of work. This artist is based in Reykjavik, Iceland, And these little pieces of paper here are actually lines from poems. I love this wall. I believe you say it Huame Plinsa, 29 Psalms. This text curtain runs the length of one gallery. It's a 50-meter curtain. It features suspended steel letters that together create text from poems such as Blake and Baudelaire, transforming the abstract and intangible notion of language into a beautifully tactile and physical work that illustrates in a visual way the beauty of poetry. And so I really love this because, look, you can walk through this thing. This thing casts shadows. And so you are immersing yourself in the poetry. You can interact with it. And I gave this one as a teaser at one of our earlier meetings, but this is by the same artist. And the text here comes from sources like biblical texts, classic literature, Dante's Divine Comedy, and poetry by William Blake. And even though you may or may not be able to actually read what's going on, you can stand inside it and just experience that in a different way. And these figures, I didn't put the actual name of it here because this artist has done this several times, and there's these figures all over the world. Instead of burning books, we cut them up. Yes, but we save copies, so we're not destroying the books forever. And then interactive digital poetry. So I mentioned earlier that I wasn't, for the most part, going to cover poetry that we write on our word presser that's on a flat screen. This one is a website, but I included it here because it does have a 3-dimensionality to it. So when you go there, and you can also experience this by putting on a virtual reality headset, it feels like you are in a 4-walled room. And what's happened here is Benjamin Laird wrote Core Values, this particular piece, in response to Dorothea McKellar's classic Australian poem, My Country. Laird's work is displayed in a 3-dimensional box, viewed in browser or using the virtual reality headset. Text is broken, animated, and infused with geographical coordinates and data. Unlike McKellar's sweeping plains, mountain ranges, and flooding rains, Laird's poem evokes claustrophobia. It critiques McKellar's poem, creating an Australia where the reader feels trapped. And then this, I did one more website because there's a 3-dimensional element to 9 billion branches as well. And what this artist has done is, see all these arrows here? You can click and visit this kind of imaginary mansion and get different rooms. And then you'll click on, say, the bed, and it brings up a poem. You can click on the dresser, and it brings up a poem. And you go to some of these arrows, and it's not a room it brings you to, but it's a picture of the human body. And you click on the shoulder, and you get a poem. You click on the intestines, and you get a poem. And so it was very trippy. But it kind of brought that you're exploring a mansion 3-dimension to you. Okay, this was from 2012. Poet Jason Lewis, Associate Professor in Concordia's Department of Design and Computation Arts, is using mass media to put poetry back in the hands of the people with a suite of 10 new digital poetry apps. It's known as the Poem, that means Poems for Excitable Mobile Media. And it's a series of poems written and designed to be read on touch devices. So you could go to an exhibit and it'd be a big screen you could touch, or you could do it off of your personal device. So there's not too much sound to this, but I want to just play this so you can see these fingers interacting with the words. So some of these poems were already put in there. And so just when you were ready for the next phrase, you could go ahead and touch, and then the words would appear where you want. You could drag them around. There were also some live feeds that you could get to feed into it, or you could type your own text in and get it to do the same thing. So you can design and structure to generate original poems that can be rewritten at the tap of the screen. right. That gives you an idea of that. Plinko poetry. How many of you are familiar with blackout poetry, where you have a text and you just select certain words within a found text to make a poem? This is that idea. It's just done in an interactive way on a screen. So these are live news feeds going through this screen. So you may or may not get something that makes a lot of sense, but I think the point is that you can try to read your own meaning into it once your poem is selected. And I want to read a quote from one of the artists slash designers here. Many children played again and again, excitedly waiting for their poem to be printed out and proudly read aloud. When they were not sure about a word, their parents always explained it and corrected the pronunciation. We were delighted to see these little curious minds. We were more than happy to see that Plinko poetry created a learning opportunity filled with fun. And isn't that delightful? Yes, I'm enjoying the arcade music as well. I want to go back and see, I think Rachel said just saw Van Gogh immersive in Indy, which was his paintings via 150 projectors. Some of these art poetry works remind me of what could be immersive poetry portrayed by projectors in the near future. Yes, that's great. This one I'm so excited to show you. This just opened. It was meant, it says 2020 because that's when it was meant to open, but because of COVID, they had to delay this, and it just opened on October the 1st. It's done by British set designer S. Devlin. It's the UK pavilion at the Dubai Expo 2020, which is now happening in 2021. So I'm just going to play you this little excerpt explaining this, and recognize that they expect about 25 million visitors to see this thing.
The UK Pavilion is based on Professor Stephen Hawking's breakthrough message. The idea is if we as mankind were to send a message into space, what would that message be? So we've brought the themes of space, of artificial intelligence and poetry together on this pavilion. What we ask the visitor to do is to join us and to come through something called the Maze of Aspiration. First thing that people will experience when they come into the pavilion is content taking you through a UK story of space all the way to the atom. As you work your way through the vitrines, through the Maze of Aspirations, you'll reach the top of the pavilion. At that moment, we ask you to pause, to contemplate, to reflect, to pick a word that you contribute to that collective message, that idea if we were to put a message together and send it to space, what would that message be? So by contributing to that, you contribute to that message that we might want to share with another species.
we'll pause there, but I just want us to pause and marvel at the fact we've talked about poetry, which is highly personal, just for ourselves, maybe tattooed on our own bodies or our own fingernails. But these people here in Dubai does nothing small, but they're not only saying, hey, we can crowdsource millions of people creating a poem that speaks for all humanity. Not only that, but it speaks so well for humanity that we could project this thing to aliens and it would speak for us. I mean, that is impressive to me.
Mhm.
Yes, the Burma shave signs. Yes, that's also a form of visual poetry. That's great. Whoop. And then just briefly here, this is a poem bot. And this is designed so that it can travel to libraries, to conferences, and it will spit out on demand poetry from websites that you select that you have creative control over, or from the public domain. So you can just set it up and, a kid can come along or an adult can come along and press the button and here's your poem for the day.
Cool.
Which leads us into poetry boxes, and I'll breeze through these. But that could be simply putting poetry on boxes. And then there's this phenomenon of poetry boxes. And these are in a lot of communities. Maybe you have one in your community. I'd love to see that in the chat box if you do have one of these. But the idea is that you are either putting poetry there that the community can walk by and take, or it's a box where the community can put their poetry. So they come in all shapes and sizes here. And it's quite the movement. Here is a box that's magnetic poetry, but you can reorder the actual wood blocks. You can purchase this for $200. Yes, we will get Deborah to my Jonah stuff. It's a coming. And then here's a poetry shadow box. Here's a poetry box, which is based on a Japanese card game. The game comprises the first and last images of poems on cards that have related images, including portraits of the poets on the flip side. The aim is to match the first and last lines. Oh, I love the idea, George, about putting the poems on Christmas gift wrapping paper. That's great. This was just another way to display poems, but to roll them up and put them in a little cigarette box.
I don't think I do that with the bottles, the Jonah.
Oh, yes. Spike just reminded me that the Jonah project I referenced, we did have a poet who also delved into 3D and put little poems on scrolls inside tiny little bottles as if they were going to be thrown out into the ocean. Very Jonah themed. I'm so excited to talk about poetry meant to be destroyed. We've talked about tombstones, something that we want to be there for decades, if not centuries, left behind us to commemorate us or loved ones. There's also poetry that's meant to be destroyed. It could be the napkin poetry that we discovered earlier, or it could be poetry written in ice that's going to melt. Wow. This one is at a resort, and they do this every year. This is the night before Christmas. And so there's a little display, and they will feature some couplets and illustrate it. So it's only there for a short time. I don't know what's going on in this picture. I would love to find out. I found this from a skating blog, and they did not reference where they got it, and I could not find it on reverse image search. But it looks like this boat is going to run into words, and maybe that forms a poem. I would love to know. But just, I have my doubts this actually exists, because how would you freeze enough of these words and then place them into nature? But wouldn't it be fascinating if this did exist? And the idea that this is stuff in nature that's eventually going to melt. Yeah, the mandala poetry, were we to do that, yes, would be destroyed. View here. This is a series of artworks. This one's on Lake Ontario, and there are basically wooden frames. You pour water in them, you take away the wood, and it leaves one word. So this is view. This one here is not a poem, but just to illustrate my fascination with this poetry meant to be destroyed, I want to share a little video of melting icemen.
An artist in Chile has come up with a Chile way to get people engaging with her latest project. by creating an army of 1,000 frozen icemen and asking volunteers to help create and display them in a race not only against the clock, but also against the rising temperature. Brazilian sculptor Nelly Azevedo created the tiny ice sculptures with the aim that they would invoke a range of different interpretations amongst the crowd of onlookers as the figures slowly melted away into the Santiago pavement.
This work was planned to be a monument, but seeing as it's open to interpretation, it can be understood in a lot of different ways.
The University of Chile had invited the artists to participate in their environmental law conference, where climate change was hot on the agenda, and as soon as the figures were in place, Mother Nature was doing her worst to spoil the party, reducing the army of sculptures to nothing more than a puddle in less than an hour.
Wow.
So I don't know if that makes you sad as an artist or if that intrigues you as an artist. I think both are legitimate responses. You know, we think of making art as something that will last. And I love the idea of it being so immediate that what if you were to put, you have one word per ice cube and the community gets to help arrange it. And it's one of those things that you have to be there in the moment to experience that art as a sort of live performance or it is gone. And that could make all kinds of powerful statements there about whatever your subject is, be it environmentalism or, maybe the fleeting nature of life. I'm just intrigued by that. You could also write your poetry on the beach. This is a contest held by a poetry group, and the prize is $100. You can fly out to this location and be part of it. There's an entry fee. And before the sea washes it away, they do a drone video of it. So you can be part of that. But this poetry is, a limited time only appearance. You can have your chance to win $100. Ice Festival in Frankfurt. Thank you, John. A poem could be carved into a chunk and it would melt away. Yes, absolutely. I did not find any Etch-a-Sketch poems, but clearly you can write words in an Etch-a-Sketch, and I'm dying to find an Etch-a-Sketch in a Goodwill or in an antique shop and write a poem and leave it for the next person, and then they'll shake it up and it'll be gone. Kind of like Chuck, you and your napkin. Why not write poems here in as a crop circle? It's there for one season, or put it here in your corn maze. Again, I couldn't find examples of poems, but just examples of, yes, you can write words. And I couldn't find any examples of poems in fire, but people do write words in fire. And thinking of love and burning love, I am intrigued to chisel a poem into a log and throw it in a fire. And maybe it could be a form of catharsis, or maybe it could be a statement of the burning love. I don't know, but I just feel like that could be performative poetry. And then I know I'm running out of time, so briefly, touchable poetry artwork. Just two more things to get through. This is called Future Biometrics. I love this because what's happened is this is printed on a 3D printer. It is open source, so you can print this at home if you have a 3D printer. And you see there are words there in English, but there's also Braille. And it's a little hard to see from this angle, but each of these little pieces has a little pop out end and then a little hole so you can click them together. And so there is a recommended way to put it together on the left. You can get this from the website. But you can also, the poet encourages you to reorder her poem and to have different configurations. And I love how accessible this is. Not just that any poet can reorder it, but there are no barriers whatsoever to a blind poet in this situation. And now down to talking about my Jonah piece. So here is what inspired me. This right here, this is a Pakistani American artist who has formed a giant metal cube. And then as light shines through it, what is reflected in the gallery space are Muslim designs that you might find like in a mosque, for example. And as this artist was speaking, what caught my head was this cube. I kept staring at this cube thinking I could put my poetry in a cube. And of course, like anything that you look at, it kind of, the idea turns into your own, you shape it. But I did indeed wind up with a cube. So you will see here some of the usual suspects. Thank you for coming out to support me and the other artists. This is at the Jewish Community Center, where we all presented our final pieces, be they music or painting or weird poems. So I will read here my artist statement to explain this. It's called Inside and Outside the Whale. It's a Dropbox poem. An exterior poem is formed when the lid is raised, and an interior poem is formed when the lid is lowered. The exterior poem represents the worldview that Jonah has before being swallowed by the whale. It is a symmetrical poem with defined boundaries, just as Jonah's understanding of morality and justice are very clear cut. I wanted my poem to literally descend, as Jonah did, into an interior space of contemplation. Here, the rigid pattern of the poem is broken, the words reordered into new meaning. What emerges is messier, but grace is always messy. The exterior poem is two-dimensional, while the interior poem is three-dimensional. Jonah's story is about his struggle with God for forgiving Jonah's enemies. While he does not reach the same conclusions I did, this piece represents my own struggle between the appeal of a clearly defined system of rules that reinforces justice and the chaotic mercy we all actually need, even those who have hurt us. So, the concept here, and I don't know how much everybody knows about the story of Jonah. It does appear in different religious texts, from Christian to Jewish to Muslim. But Jonah hates the Ninevites. He doesn't want to have anything to do with their redemption. So he runs away. He's swallowed by the whale. And inside the whale, he has a change of heart. And so when that lid is raised, I've constructed this thing of PVC pipe, and shout out to Spike for teaching me how to shop and cut PVC pipe, dowel rods, wires, and then those little circles you see are words on wood. And I took a class at the library to use the laser printer to figure out how to do this. But they dangle from different heights to make one poem when the lid's up, and then when the lid's down, then it reorders. And my concept was to make this fully interactive so someone could lift the lid themselves, because I'm not very good with construction. I had to do it or the thing would fall apart, but that was my concept, so it would be touchable. So this is a little bit easier to see what's going on. This was my plan. So the exact same words are going to make two different poems. So this is when it's raised, the lid is raised. So no, not them. Acidic soul wounds still ache without healing. Lord, why saving water for those who don't thirst like me? Forgiveness, sinner, grace deserve. And I'll show you this in prose so it's easier to understand. But the same words reordered make this messy shape when you close the lid. So here's representing the rigid morality system, and this is the messy morality system where grace exists. And to understand the poems better, here they are in prose form. So outside the whale, when it's lit up, no, not them. Acidic soul wounds still ache without healing. Lord, why saving water for those who don't thirst like me? Forgiveness, sinner, grace deserve. And then inside the whale, acidic ache, no wounds healing. Lord, why not them? Still, soul, don't those who without forgiveness thirst for saving water deserve grace like me, sinner? And let me tell you what, it was a math quiz and a half to figure out how to make all those words reform and work.
I bet.
So, but through that experience, it changed my definition of poetry a little bit. You know, I wanted it to have a hands-on element. If I had fully realized it, it would have been something that the community could flip up and down. But also the idea of it being three-dimensional and transformative. And so now that we've been through this, you know, very long whirlwind tour, I would love to hear your reflections about any of these three questions. And you can unmute yourself for this. So what is poetry? What struck you about any of these particular designs? And are you now inspired to take your poetry in a new direction, put it in a different place?
Yes. I say yes. I think I'm inspired. This is the definition of poetry has changed for me with your presentation. I now see it as so much more than just a written word on a, you know, piece of paper or in a book or something like that. I got to think about this, but yes is my short answer. Wow.
Sweet.
I'm actually editing a second book and thinking of how I can do a pop-up piece right in the middle of it that will perfectly display one thought that I've been fighting with for months because of this. So
I
have two-
love that.
I have two responses. On the one hand, I am inspired to put up something like a bulletin board when we move to the continuous care retirement community in a couple weeks. And the other is there anything, any combination of words that is not poetry?
Mm.
No. Poetry
Yeah, that-
to me is essence, and it's the essence of our being. And anytime we express our being, no matter what medium we choose to express it in, that becomes our poetry. And our poetry can be, resonate with everyone or one person, but whatever form we put it into, it's the poetry of our essence.
That was well put. It reminds me of when I was in music school, they challenged us to define music. Because, for example, there's a music piece where it's basically a certain amount of time of just listening to the crowd as the orchestra sits on stage. Is that music? So, yeah, I love the way you expressed that. That was great.
What the word I really like is action. I think to put our poetry into action and, stand up and read it or put it into art. I've been making some small homemade books, and this gave me a great amount of ideas on how to make it more 3D. So I'm excited to take some of these ideas and put them into action.
That's great. Thank you, Chuck, for citing what I was trying to reference. John Cage. Mm-hmm. Great.
I think a lot of people have seen the barn art that's been going on, but I'd like to see it done on quilts someplace.
I love that idea. That's great. Yeah, when we wear something, it makes it so personal, and any sort of textile you can wrap around yourself.
Yeah, I think textile art and poetry is a natural, almost natural combination, Especially like if you know how to silk screen, and you could silk screen on a scarf or a shawl or a pillowcase or, something like that. You could silk screen a poem. I don't know how to do that, but I've seen silk screening words, on scarves and things.
That's great. Nancy brings up that Faith Reingold, I hope is how you say it, has words on her quilts. That's great. Okay, if I have given everybody enough space to give your ideas, I know I've gone a little bit over time, so I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share and turn it back over to Deborah. Thank you, everybody.